The 20th anniversary of Halo Combat Evolved is a lot more significant than what it initially implies. The 20th anniversary of the Halo franchise is also the 20th anniversary of Xbox as a brand and as a console line, but there's of course got to be something that initially propelled Xbox into the spotlight and showed us that they had a position in the landscape of gaming, and today we know Xbox as one of the big three console makers. Halo is what sparked this success. It revolutionized console shooters and created an entirely new genre of gaming and is a giant inspiration for many games made even today. Inspiring giants such as Call of Duty, Gears of War, and Splinter Cell, let's see how the original Xbox's launch title, released on November 15th, 2001, holds up 20 years later. 2001 wasn't a year where any shooters had stories that matched the chaos, energy, and quality of their gameplay components, and in general, the amount of shooters was much more scarce than that of today. But especially in the console department, developers didn't even try to create a console shooter. In 2001, the thought of trying to create a shooter where you need precision, accuracy, and good controls to properly enjoy yourself while playing the game, a controller with many of its imperfections as well as its ability to not being able to aim with the sheer amount of precision presented by a keyboard and mouse, made the entire idea of a fantastic console shooter entirely redundant. But when Xbox entered the gaming scene, they needed to bring something that would make their console actually compelling to a market which was primarily dominated by Japanese tech companies. They need innovation, and with that comes revolution. That's what Halo Combat Evolved is. Of course, there's the very obvious genius implications of Halo Combat Evolved, such as its revolutionary and incredibly innovative gameplay, which I'll delve into in the next part of this video, as well as the fact that with the introduction of Xbox came Xbox Live, which was the first of its kind to allow players across the world to connect into one game, where they would play matches of Slayer, Capture the Flag, and more. Then there was the booming of couch co-op games, much of which Halo itself contributed a large portion of itself to, with fluid and incredibly well done split screen, which made this game one of the best to play with friends over at your home or anywhere else with an Xbox. But I don't want to talk about these two aspects of this ingenious video game quite yet, and instead I want to talk about one of the other aspects that Halo absolutely revolutionized, and that is an engaging and riveting video game story. At that point in gaming, there was a few standout titles that delivered amazing and incredibly well-written narratives, but these games were sporadic, and there wasn't a large quantity of them, and definitely none that used the gameplay of a first-person shooter to build its story. Sure, later in the decade, games with amazing and beautifully deep stories would not at all be a rare occurrence, but at that point in gaming, where the switch to 3D was still a fairly new aspect of the scene in general, the gameplay of games was moreover the focus, and instead the narrative was just there to build the set pieces for the gameplay to be taken to its highest potential. There were the big innovative standouts such as Ocarina of Time, Half-Life, and of course the remarkable Final Fantasy VII. But Xbox was a new brand. There was almost no faith in this American company randomly joining a market that they knew nothing about, and worries about them competing with Nintendo or even Sony for that matter was almost non-existent. If they'd never really crafted any compelling games, what would lead to consumers thinking that they would be able to even compete with these giants in the slightest? Well, Microsoft proved everyone wrong. Halo Combat Evolved is phenomenal. The narrative is so simplistic in nature, but when looking into it further, you see an absolutely riveting tale of humanity. This notion of humanity is definitely not as expanded or not as extensive as the narratives in the other and later Halo games suggest, but it was a start to the story of a super soldier. Everyone knows him. He's 100% a solidified icon in the gaming scene. Just his helmet alone is enough to make people go absolutely crazy, and I think we've seen enough proof of this with the reveal of Halo Infinite.
Oh shit, this is Halo, dude.
Master Chief is such a phenomenal vessel for the player to get involved into the world of Halo. He's serious, he's vicious, he's powerful, and he makes you, the player, controlling his every action feel invincible. But there's more than a few times where the game strips you of this invincibility to make you remember that Chief isn't just a robot. There's a living human behind that helmet. And although he might be void of many of the basic emotions of humans, he's not invincible. But the game balances this notion so much throughout the game, and it's perfectly done. 1 second you're blowing up an overpowering Covenant battleship, and the next you realize you've been tricked by an AI monitor whose deceit isn't all that hidden in the slightest, making you feel vulnerable in the moment. It's moments like this that balance out the narrative of Halo Combat Evolved and give it this feel of authenticity and humanity, which are themes that are explored dramatically more in the follow-ups of this game. But this game started the line for the other games to spread it, and it did it with excellent execution. Most of the game it feels like you yourself are fighting against these monstrous alien armies, especially when you see the Marines that are sent with you on missions die fairly fast and you're basically trying to survive out there by yourself. But Master Chief's a damn super soldier. Mutilate those enemies, blow them up, shoot them, and punch your way to disassemble the unstoppable armies of the Covenant. Speaking of the Covenant, we need to discuss how great they work in the context of the game and how well they work as the villain. Unlike many other stories, there's no real antagonist in Halo, but more a larger group that makes up those antagonistic values known as the Covenant, an alien species who dominate much of the galaxy and wage war against humanity, which they have earlier lost to in previous encounters. But in this game, they come back with a bigger and broader plan that will allow for the domination of their empire throughout the galaxy. It sounds a little bit too much like Star Wars there, but it is of course quite different. The Covenant are led by religious leaders called the Prophets, who worship an ancient civilization known as the Forerunners, who had perished fighting another alien race in the game known as the Flood. But before we talk about the Flood, the Covenant's role in the story makes the game's main premise so much more interesting, and their objective is quite compelling and interesting, and you really do want to see how the story takes you along this path to destroy their plans of destruction. That's where the Halo comes in. A large ring world where we early on learn is what the Covenant are interested in turning into a galactic weapon that holds much religious significance to them. We then learn that the Forerunners were the creators of the ring, but there's something else in Halo that terrifies the Covenant from coming too close to fulfilling their objective. Here comes the Flood, a parasitic species who multiply and evolve while fighting their enemies with absolutely overwhelming numbers. They are free now after 1,000 years due to this interstellar conflict between humanity and the Covenant. The Flood quickly sweep across the ring of Halo, devastating both human and Covenant forces alike. Of course, as you know the events of Halo, this leads to the destruction of the ring, after the Chief realizes that its power is too much of a risk and would lead to the destruction of all sentient beings across the universe. The Flood and the Covenant fight you during your journey, but you as the Chief must of course discover the horrifying secrets hidden within the ring, and fight back against the two overwhelming alien forces attacking you from all angles. It's such an interesting narrative and grips you from the very start with all of the insane stunts from the Chief, the amazing set pieces, well made and intuitive dialogue with characters that are very well developed and likable. It's one of the first of its kind, and its revolution in its narrative would be carried out for the rest of the Halo series, and is easily one of the greatest aspects of the franchise as a whole. The storyline and gameplay is so tightly interwoven with one another, and this perfect duality of the two greatest aspects of the game to collide with one another to create a game of impactful magnitude lends itself well to representing the true greatness of the game that started it all. There's a lot more to say about it as well. The sci-fi setting was new and innovative. The mysterious nature of the entire story as it gradually unfolds is also beautifully executed, and that's what the game does so well in its story. The execution is near perfect. There's no cheesy dialogue, no need for dragged on plot points. It knows where it's going, and it goes there without hesitation while bringing the player along the chaotic road that you as a Chief embark on. And the music, it's beautiful, symphonic, charming, melodic, gives a sense of dread, gives a sense of victory. It's so powerful, so indicative of the themes presented throughout the game, and it outwardly pushes these varying themes down your throat to blend itself beautifully with the narrative to the point where the narrative's true potential is only truly achieved when matched with the symphonic empowerment lended by the music. It's much like what George Lucas did with Star Wars. When something grand and epic comes, there's music that reflects that notion perfectly. And then when you're in a chaotic battle, the themes then presented in that moment are perfectly balanced and fit the scenarios in the game so well. Of course, there's also slower, melodic music that presents the theme of melancholy so powerfully and wonderfully, and it's all done so well in practice, making Halo's story and music one of the driving factors as to why it's a revolutionary video game masterpiece. Now, Halo's innovation lies in the very center of its gameplay, level design, and the mechanics that bind all these aspects together. Halo's gameplay didn't outwardly define it as the first-person shooter, and not by a long shot. There were other games that utilized the genre with the same level of precision and accuracy. However, Halo's mission when using the genre would be a lot harder and innovational than that of any other first-person shooters, which were dominantly found on PCs, because of course developers were not able to find the precision and accuracy of a keyboard and mouse and then somehow seamlessly transport that over to a controller, whose controls were completely different than that of a PC, and no developer had really tried to convert the controls either. That's where Bungie came in. They were able to tailor the first-person shooter experience and seamlessly fit that onto a clunky controller, being perfectly tailored with accuracy and precision, being excellently done. But let's delve into the different aspects of the gameplay itself and see how those together build up the foundation for console shooters in the future. Firstly, the weapon system and vehicular incorporation that was so well executed in the original Halo game and of course became a staple in the franchise thus far. Halo Combat Evolved's new weapon system was so unique and different to all other shooters of the time due to two major reasons. The first is that the game only allows for players to be able to hold two weapons at a time, thus forcing the player to make different trade-offs as they progress throughout the game. As you lose all the ammo in your assault rifle, you'll kill a Covenant elite and then pick up their plasma rifle. This makes you mix up the types of weapons you use, and this ultimately makes you diversify the arsenal that you use to take down all the alien forces coming at you. In today's generation, this small and yet impactful mechanic might seem like old news, and sure it does, but in the dawn of the original Halo's release, mechanics like these were not at all common, and the fact that this small mechanic changed many of the core mechanics that build up first-person shooters as a whole is just another point as to the revolutionary innovation that Halo brought with its release. Then there's many other core controls that would be embedded into all other console shooters after the release of Halo. One of these very key controls being that Halo Combat Evolved had a single, separate button that was designed specifically for throwing grenades at enemies, making them a much more significant tool that would be utilized a lot more in combat in both the game's campaign and its stellar multiplayer. Now for the vehicles. I'm pretty sure anyone that knows even a little bit about Halo or has played even one game understands how iconic some of the vehicles in the franchise are. Who doesn't know the Warthog, the Banshee, the Ghost? They're all such iconic and innovative vehicles which all got their introduction into the series with the very first installment. The vehicles in this game, much like the many different weapons featured, are so diversified and unique from one another, allowing for players to use both land and air-based vehicles in a third-person view. But it still works perfectly when it switches the perspective, and that's how it should always work. The first-person controlling of vehicles only works in some certain games, but in Halo's case, the key decision to make all use of vehicles only work in the third-person perspective is genius, and I couldn't imagine how much less intuitive the vehicles in this game would be if they were restricted to the dimensions of a first-person perspective. The vehicles are also balanced extremely well. There's no one key vehicle that will allow you to plow through enemies and cause destruction across an entire level. There's a few different and key vulnerabilities to the vehicles featured, and you'll realize them fairly quickly in a playthrough, and you'll either utilize it to destroy enemy vehicles in a fast manner or to ensure that you survive encounters with other enemies that are also using vehicles to protect your vehicle from blowing up. The advantage that is presented by the vehicles in this game brings a sense of immersion and can enhance exactly how you approach different objectives in the game, giving Halo this nuanced feel of freedom in levels that almost feel sandbox in nature. And ultimately, the vehicles presented in the game definitely did lend themselves well to separate Halo from all other contemporary first-person shooters at the time of its release. Another aspect of the game's gameplay is of course the AI, which are of course going going to be essential because you don't want to fight a bunch of enemy bots that are absolutely useless in the fighting you. Halo's AI in the time of its release was quite sophisticated for when it came out. It brought in an innovative and advanced AI system where the AI in the game had many different mechanics to them that made them actually viable in battles against you. Some examples which are now so well known in the franchise are the grunts running away from the chief after you kill one of their superiors, of course being the Covenant elites. They'll also dive out of the way when you are oncoming with a vehicle, which shows the level of balance that was fitted to the vehicles in the game, as for them to not be overpowered, as most of the time trying to ram into enemies wasn't at all efficient. There's also the health mechanics that were just so unique for its time and just makes Halo stand out quite a lot even today. The player has a limited and non-regenerating health bar, which can only be fully restored if players find health packs, which are scattered throughout the gigantic sandbox levels of the game. Running completely out of this health like any other game will of course kill the chief, but the game brought in a new mechanic to balance out the fact that you can actually die very fast when not paying attention, and it balances this health system with the introduction of a shielding system. The shield will decrease in strength when you are a fighter, but unlike the health bar in the game, the shield regenerates at a good pace, but not too fast to the point where you can continue fighting in a battle while your shield slowly regenerates. Now let's talk about the fantastic level design of Halo, which is what also made it one of the most innovative and most well-made shooters of its era. I absolutely love the levels presented throughout the Halo franchise. They're so well designed, so well made, so intuitive, and there's a lot of diversity to the levels presented with the different environments created for that specific level, and how the levels all together just match every scenario and every moment in the game so perfectly. There's a wide variety of environments including human and Covenant ships which are board on your journey to stop the Covenant from weaponizing the ring of Halo. The levels are so different from one another, with changes of how the level works in terms of linearity, and then to a sandbox nature being completely differential in each level of the game. In a mission Assault on the Control Room, the level is so giant with it almost feeling like an open world environment with all these tools at your disposal such as the vehicles and weapons scattered throughout the level for you to feel like you really are in a sandbox environment. Also, the atmosphere in that particular level is awesome, as the music perfectly fits all the scenarios within that level, and it isn't gritty, eerie or dark. Instead, it's just the chief trying to find the control panel that will control the ring. However, in complete and utter contrast to this same level is a level that directly follows this one. The mission is known as 343 Guilty Spark. Such an eerie mission. The music is so slow, so melodic, and there's none of that epic music as you walk through rooms that would usually, in the game's normal design philosophy, have hordes of enemies for you to fight, but instead this level is quiet. The color palette is dark and gloomy, with only a few light sources around the entirety of the level. Same with the level of linearity. The level is so linear, and there's a strict path that the player is expected to follow if they want to go in the right direction. During the level, the eeriness comes to a small halt, and that's where the introduction of the Flood comes through, and it's a wonderful introduction to some of the weirdest alien species I've seen in gaming. Just like the Flood, the level makes you feel uneasy and not safe in your environment, and that's utter perfection, because some levels in the game make you really feel the essence of a super soldier by making you cause a rampage throughout the ranks of the Covenant. The game balances this with making you feel scared as if you were in that situation, while in reality you're still that same super soldier. This level of linearity is balanced so well, and the game takes you through so many different environments which all fit the world and feel that the Halo games want to present to the player. That sci-fi setting with an interstellar war between humanity and the Covenant, and with the introduction of the Flood, the drastic change in tone is also excellently executed. You're also going to have to backtrack through some of the levels, and you might be able to find some routes and paths that weren't available the first time that you went through that stage, and it adds a level of freshness to a level that you already thought you knew. All in all, the gameplay of Halo is so innovative, so revolutionary, yet so simplistic that it's so easy to just pick up and play, and with its stellar mechanics that are now mainstay in many first-person franchises even today, to the level design which is so well tailored to the experience that Bungie intended to deliver with their breakout title that would ultimately solidify Halo as a mainstay franchise in the gaming scene as a whole. Originally, for this video, I wasn't actually going to discuss Halo's co-op or multiplayer, and instead it would just be a deeper analysis of the game's narrative, gameplay, and level design. On further thought, I've come to the extremely obvious realization that not including or even touching upon the basis that builds up the co-op experience of Halo would be an entire disservice to the franchise as a whole, and to us fans who've kept with this franchise for many years through its lucrative times and its more nuanced games as well. The introduction of split screen in Halo was one of the first of its its kind. It allowed for players to cooperatively play through the entirety of the game's stellar campaign, and it wasn't forced at all, and instead it seamlessly fit into the ecosystem of the game, and is what I would consider a main feature of Halo games going forward into the future. And of course, Halo Combat Evolved itself. That's probably why the revelation that Infinite's launch will not feature the means of campaign co-op feels like such a huge setback for the franchise, especially since the original Halo game itself, the feature has been there from the very beginning and is now a staple of the franchise altogether. Despite that, like most Halo fans, I am of course still excited for the release of Infinite and will of course be playing through its campaign, but it is extremely disappointing to learn that I won't even be able to play one of the greatest aspects of Halo, of course being its campaign in a cooperative nature. But that's besides the point. At this point, co-op games of course did exist. You had Super Smash Bros, Mario Kart, and literally any fighting game of course, because no one really plays those by themselves. However, there was no proper tuning as to bring in the co-op experience without sacrificing another aspect of the game, and in this scenario that aspect should have been the depth of Halo's narrative. However, Combat Evolved prevailed and made sure that it still primarily tailored its campaign experience to be one that could compete with other games focused on its narrative, but was able to put a twist on the concept by bringing the unique feature of split screen. I think that anyone who's ever played a Halo game has played it with someone else. It's become to the point where I refer to the game as a co-op one, and the franchise as a whole, due to how much the developers at Bungie and at 343 Industries have made sure that players will be able to derive as much fun and bliss from the game's campaign experience as possible without sacrificing absolutely anything. Not many games are able to do co-op right, especially in today's age, but in modern times the inclusion of co-op doesn't feel as well made or as intuitive as it did in older games, because nowadays the feature that is co-op is only thrown into the game as a last minute addition, just as a marketing ploy or something for the developers to boast about, but it's not really well executed. It doesn't feel like it's necessary for the game. It doesn't make the game better in the slightest, and if you were to remove the mechanic entirely from the game, it literally would change nothing about the core mechanics or systems of the game as a whole. In complete contrast to this, the Halo co-op experience will forever remain as one of my favorite in gaming due to its intuitive system in the way that it works, so it doesn't feel forced, only put in there as a last minute feature, but it instead feels like Microsoft really tried to make sure that the game's co-op was focused and tailored on just as much as any other aspect of the game, which has ensured its spot in being one of the most tailored, most fun, and well-made co-op and split screen systems in gaming even today. The legacy of Halo Combat Evolved is felt even today. It led the way for the creation of more fantastically crafted Halo games, all of which would go on to revolutionize the gaming scene on their own, with different aspects of the games being completely diversified and so innovative, making them each a standout title that can stand on its own when being analyzed. And that's exactly what Halo Combat Evolved crafted. Even today, the game holds up well, maybe not in a graphical aspect, and it definitely isn't groundbreaking in its visuals like it was in 2001, but with the anniversary edition of the game, it's aged well, and the edition goes to show how even when the game's core mechanics are not even touched when remastering it, it didn't even make a difference as to how good the game is in general. It's a classic, it's a hit, it's a revolution in the gaming scene, and that's why it will be remembered for as long as gaming goes, as it has solidified its spot as one of the most revolutionary video games of all time, and easily as one of the most revolutionary first-person shooters ever made. I just added this section really quickly as I don't always want to end these critiques and analysis on a big note. If you've watched the video to this point, I really appreciate you, and if you're here, why not consider subbing to the channel, especially if you want more content like this. For my next critique or analysis, I think I'll be making one on the prospects of insignificance in Red Dead Redemption 2, so more of a video essay, but I'll be going in deep in terms of analyzing core aspects of the game and how it alludes to such a notion. Also, something to note as of now, I'll be pushing the uploads to once every 2 weeks to ensure that I can keep up the same level of quality while preserving the length of these videos at the same time. I've got a lot more interesting videos coming up, so consider staying tuned into this channel for more of this content. Until the next time I see you all, have a good day and an absolutely fantastic week. Peace.